Welcome, everybody. I'm Michael Rugel from the National Museum of American Jewish Military History. It's a pleasure to be here today with Steve Stoliar, whose new book, Salamis Swastikas, Letters Home from a G.I. Jew, compiles the World War II letters of his father, Staff Sgt. David Stoliar, the letters sent home to his wife and baby, and we get to follow David Stoliar from his stateside training through North Africa and through Europe during the war. Speaking generally, letters are a great historic resource, giving us contemporary accounts of what was happening in a war. They're often far from perfect sources. Letters from often minimize the danger of war, particularly when they're being sent home to Jewish mothers. Sometimes censors have removed the exact details that historians may be looking for. Sometimes letters were written only in downtime and they focus on what some consider the less exciting aspects of wartime. But well-written wartime correspondence does more than any other source to let us get to know an individual fighting a war. And that's where the letters compiled in Salamis and Swastikas are so great. They give us a real sense of David Stoliar, of the sacrifice of being away from a young family, his perspective his unique perspective of being a Jewish soldier fighting the Nazis. And I think getting to know those wars, those fighting wars, getting to know them as individuals, is probably the most important part of understanding this history. So Salamis and Swastikas is a great resource for us. We'll get to questions at the end. Please submit any questions using the Q&A function on the bottom of your Zoom app. The chat is also open, but if you'd like Steve to answer your questions, please use that Q&A function and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. Steve Stoliar's previous book, Raised Eyebrows, My Years Inside Groucho's House, chronicles the last 3 years in the life of Groucho Marx and how Steve went from a Marx Brothers obsessed college student to Groucho's personal secretary and archivist working inside his house. And in February, it was announced that Cold Iron Pictures will be producing a film version of Raised Eyebrows. So we get that to look forward to. Steve Stoliar has been a professional writer for nearly 40 years, providing material for Dick Cavett, as well as penning episodes of such television series as Murder, She Wrote, Simon & Simon, the new WKRP in Cincinnati, Legend, and Sliders. He's been a consultant on a number of books and documentaries about Groucho and his various siblings. He's written and produced documentaries on John Lennon, Elvis Presley, Shemp Howard, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Additionally, he's provided voices for various animated specials, including Frosty Returns, The Oz Kids, You're in the Super Bowl, Charlie Brown, and Snoopy's Reunion. Born in St. Louis, he now makes his home in Studio City, California, where Steve joins us from. Steve, it's all yours.
Thank you, Mike. I could listen to you go on for hours about my life, but I think that would be a finite interest to the viewers. You mentioned minimizing the danger that the soldiers were in. It's funny that you mentioned that because throughout these letters, my father is constantly saying, above all, I'm fine, I will be fine, and I'll be home soon. Don't worry about me. And then a few weeks later, he'll say, well, now that I'm not in the same place I was in before, I can tell you that the Luftwaffe strafed a Jeep that I had just been in. Or now I can tell you that when we were in Italy, there was a whoosh and a crash, and it was a bomb that came through the ceiling of the building we were in. Luckily, it was a dud. So above all, remember that I will come home to you safe and sound, and there won't be any. So he kept giving Mom reassurances that he'd be fine, and then later on fessing up that there were dangers. So if I had been my mom, I wouldn't have believed the reassurances. But anyway, my parents were, by the way, it only says your name on my screen. Does that mean that nothing's happening now, or are people hearing this?
Yeah, they should be hearing it. We got 105 people on.
And you can see my face for what it's worth?
Yes.
Okay, just wanted to check that. My parents were born in St. Louis, Missouri. My mother was Amy Schwartz and my dad was Dave Stoliar. Came from Jewish families. Curiously, my dad's grandparents were Orthodox, but his parents weren't Jewish at all. And so, likewise, my father was more a secular Jew than someone who observed the Sabbath, much less kept it holy, went to Friday night services. It didn't seem to be a vital part of his daily life, but he certainly was into the cultural aspects of it, the Yiddish expressions, the foods, gefilte fish and matzo balls and salami and so forth. So he was certainly Jewish, and his friends were almost entirely Jewish. But it didn't seem, certainly the father that my sisters and I knew didn't seem to be deeply religious. And his upbringing wasn't deeply religious. But what comes out in the letters is there's the gradual unfolding of realizing what it means to be a Jew, and a Jewish American in particular. And as he, deals with the anti-Semitism of different countries and of the Nazi atrocities, he seems to be much more in touch with being Jewish. And there are a lot more references to God in the letters than we ever heard in real life. And not just in a rhetorical way, but he would say, I guess God needed to take this person from us in order as a trade-off for the setbacks we've had, or I pray that God watches over you, or, when he was in Germany saying, I see these people going off to church, but what kind of God can they pray to when they allowed a man like Hitler to come to power? So it was an interesting element of his personality that he was Jewish, but it didn't seem to be an integral part of his daily life. My parents married in January of 41, and they had a little girl named Carol Francis. In June of 42, Dad was drafted in January of 43. For some reason, he was under the impression that if you're married and have a child, you'll be exempt from duty. So when he got his draft notice, he went down to the office and explained that to the officer in charge, who found it all very interesting. And then off Dad went to basic training in Clearwater, Florida. He was wrong. You do have to serve if you're a father and a husband. My mom and Dad vowed to write each other every day, and they came shockingly close to achieving that goal. My dad was overseas from late 43 to late 45. So there were over 500 letters that he wrote, and none of them was one page. Some of them were 8 to 10 pages long, a mixture of handwritten and typed, because he was in charge of supply, and so he had to type requisition slips. So he had rare access to a typewriter, and he just was incredibly observant, and his narrative is really rich and detailed. The people that he met, the things he saw, the sights, the smells, the sounds, and also he was remarkably more historically and politically aware than I think a lot of GIs were. So when he writes about, he's in the middle of a landmark historic event, World War II, and yet he's reflecting on war, on past wars, World War I, on Wilson dying, trying to put the League of Nations together, thinking about the future. Even when the atomic bomb is dropped on Japan, he's thinking, but it brought about the end, but what have we unleashed? Can we ever really control atomic energy? So there's a lot of political and historical perspective that informs his letters that made them more than just average, miss you guys, miss the homestead, can't wait to be home. My sisters and I never really thought to read these until about 10 years ago. As my dad would send the letters home to my mom in St. Louis, she would put them through the 3-hole punch with the little adhesive reinforcements on the circles, and put them in binders. And those binders stayed in the garage even when we moved to California in '62. They just stayed in the garage. And I think between the fact that we felt that they weren't really any of our business, you know, the letters that a homesick soldier writes home, and that it was such dense material. There weren't any pictures. Everything was single space, page after page after page after page after page. Was not conducive to wanting to sit down and go through it. So we didn't get around to doing that until about 10 years ago. He also had a scrapbook of photos. And even as a kid, I loved looking through those because, I mean, they had bombed buildings and dead Nazis and pictures of Bob Hope. And Dad loved talking about those. So I was very familiar with his photos, but the letters were a complete mystery to us until we started reading through them about 10 years ago. And I thought, I think these are of interest to more than just my immediate family. You know, there's that thing where you think, well, no, you know, my baby's the cutest baby and everyone will want to see his picture, or everyone wants to see our home movies of going to Yosemite or something like that, which is kind of self-indulgent and rarely accurate. But in this case, I felt that there was historical value, religious value, that it just helps flesh out the picture of what this war was like to one Jewish guy, just a regular guy from St. Louis. And I thought about like how people will discover a Civil War diary from one of their ancestors. And it's, even if the person wasn't important historically, you get that, you know, if you remember the Ken Burns Civil War documentary, you had all those, you know, dear Sarah, the winters have gotten cold, but the colonel says we're due some more blankets by Thursday. And it just brings the whole thing to life. So I felt that there really is a reason for me to sit down and input all of these hundreds and hundreds of letters totaling thousands of pages into my iMac, and then begin the task of whittling them down to book length. And what's there in the finished book is probably a little less than half of the total, because I didn't want it to be this intimidating, concise, put everything in, because there was a lot of dross. But I followed a number of threads throughout, which I explain in the introduction. And I think it makes for an interesting journey. So the first photo is of the book covers, the front and back cover. So if Mike will share the screen, remember, we should always share. There is my dad with his beloved dog, Nancy, on the front. And you can see my mom and baby Carol, the picture behind, and behind them are some of the letters that he wrote. And then there's some very gratifying blurbs on the back. Dick Cavett said it's a rare, moving, colorful, and intimate look at war from inside the beast. Woody Allen said, I couldn't have lived through what the author of these letters lived through. Great fun to read, but also heartbreaking. Steve Karras, a documentary filmmaker, said this is an important addition to the historical record. And Stephen Tobolowsky, who's an actor and also the author of My Adventures with God, called them humorous and heartbreaking, endearing, moving, and unforgettable. Again, that's a testament to my dad's letters, not to a book that I assembled it and edited it, but really those compliments go to my dad having given us this contemporaneous account of what it was like to go through the Second World War. The next picture shows there's my dad and my mom and baby Carol before Dad was shipped overseas. That was taken actually in California because Dad was assigned to Camp Pinedale near Fresno for much of 1943. And then he was shipped overseas, but he was there long enough that Mom and Carol came out and they rented an apartment in Fresno. So Dad was able to spend some quality time with his family before he was sent half a world away to fight the Nazis for several years. So what I'm going to do now is read excerpts from the letters. And they certainly have an emphasis on the Jewish angle and also more than a little reference to Passover, which has recently passed over. This was written in March of '44 in Oran, Algeria. Yesterday, I picked up the rations of Passover matzahs, which each Jewish man is allowed. We each get 3 regular boxes, not bad. It's real American matzahs made in Brooklyn. The Jews over here don't have that type. They have a round, hard matzahs, which doesn't look at all appetizing. Anyway, I spoke to the Hebrew chaplain, who was a captain, and he advised us to bring our matzahs to the synagogue with us, and we'll probably be invited to dinner by anyone there. So I'm looking forward to an unusual experience. Boy, that must really be something to see Carol Francis reading a prayer book. The amazing thing is that it has no pictures, and she still was attracted to it. Well, that's my daughter for you. I guess you had something to do with it, however. And then a week later, he went to a synagogue again in Algeria and wrote Mom a description of it. Yesterday, while on pass, I stopped at a synagogue to see what it was like inside. It was a tremendous place and had a very large interior. It had a very high dome, and the altar was also dome-shaped. The place where the Torah is kept is in an archway with velvet curtains in the doorway. There were many 7-candled candelabra and very artistic in design. The cantor's place was in the center of the place. The chief rabbi's pulpit was on the side, like the English church. The Star of David was in all the windows and in the ceiling. All around the walls were tables listing the names of the members who had died in World War I. Above the entrance to the synagogue was a balcony for the choir and a very large pipe organ. When I came, they were just getting ready to perform a wedding. The bride in bridal attire of white, carrying African lilies, and the groom in full dress with their relatives arrived on horse carriage. The attendants sat in front or on the sides, the males on one side, the females on the other. The chief rabbi placed a talith over their heads and conducted the ceremony in the French language. In between periods, the choirs sang, the organist played, and an excellent singer sang one song. Then, after they were officially married, they received the congratulations in the study of the rabbi. I told them Mazel Tov, and they understood. Well, after that, the couple left in the carriage for their new home. It was certainly a nice innovation for me, and something which I'll never see again, perhaps. Then a week later is his description of having gone to a Jewish family's house in Algeria for Seder. I took advantage of the opportunity given the Jewish soldiers, invitations to homes of native people in town. Our host's name is Mr. Alfred Ashash. They have always lived in this area. We sat down to the Seder and the ceremony was conducted in Hebrew. The Bible also had a French translation just beneath it. We all had a nice time trying to understand each other fully. I could carry on a passable conversation, but it took a little while to understand everything. We brought 3 boxes of matzahs with us, and it is far superior to the native matzahs, which was very coarse and round. It is made of a gray flour and is thicker. The way we found out that our matzahs were better was the young son of Mr. Rashash said that it tasted better. You know that a child is not diplomatic because they always speak the truth. The meal was not so very good. It was all so strange to us. The only thing we did eat was the meat, dates, and oranges. Of course, we hated to leave food on our plates because food is so scarce around here. So I had to force some of that stuff down in order to make them happy. Then in May of '44, Dad has moved to Italy. Today, I happened to pick up a few English soldiers on the road and gave them a lift. It turned out that they were Yiddish and from Palestine, Tel Aviv to be exact. So the English have finally outfitted an all-Jewish unit for active duty against the Nazis. Remember about 4 years ago, the English refused to listen to such a proposal? Well, these men are really anxious to get at the Germans. They told me they hold Friday services each week and invited me to attend. If we can get permission from the CO, we'll probably go. June of '44, still in Italy. I happened to catch a Nazi propaganda broadcast this morning, and to hear the sort of stuff they put out, you'd think they're winning the war instead of losing it. I can't see how the German people can absorb all that hooey. The Nazis stated that the Russians had lost 50,000 airplanes, 70,000 tanks, and about 12,700,000 men. If that was all true, how in the world did they ever get the Jerry's to retreat so fast and so far? Another outrageous statement was that the Jewish soldiers in the American army are receiving 25% more food than the non-Jews. They say that due to the Jewish food laws, that difference is in effect. Have you ever heard anything so ridiculous? We all eat in the same mess out of the same type of mess kits and are given the same portions that any other soldier's given. That just shows you the type of stuff they're putting out. I'm glad nobody pays any attention to that stuff. November 11th, 1944, Dad is now in France. So today is Armistice Day. Well, so we ain't meat and we're at war instead of peace to commemorate this day. It's tough that we humans are so forgetful and can't remember all the lives that have been lost in the past in wars that have brought us absolutely nothing but grief. Of course, it's hardly possible to think that I can place the Japs and Germans in that same category with us, but they do breathe. This day is just going to pass as another day of the year because in years to come, there'll be another war and wars after that. However, just to kid ourselves, we will pay tribute to our dead and dedicate this day to them, swearing that we will never again go to war. That gesture is just as hypocritical as the Jewish Day of Atonement and the confession of the Catholics. We will remember for that one day and forget for the rest of the year. I really don't know why I should get so philosophical, because as an individual, I'll never be able to do anything to correct these things that will occur inevitably. So let's let it go as a day which has gone for naught. Personally, it has only added another day to the long list of days we have been separated from each other. On the other hand, it has shortened the number of days we are to be apart. December of '44 in France, Dad went to services at a temple in Nancy. We got to the synagogue at about 4 and stood up all the time that prayers were said. It was colder than a Nazi's heart there. The place had lost a lot of its former beauty due to the Germans' destruction when they had occupied Nancy. There were still a number of Jews in the city who turned out for the services, so they must have prayed doubly hard. The rabbi was a chaplain, and the whole service took only about an hour. After it was over, he announced that he had a number of mezuzahs, that small metal tube with prayers in it. So I went over and got one. That was the first time I'd gone to services since I left the States. It was sort of uncomfortable at first. However, after I concentrated on the prayer book, I fell right into the thing. As you may have guessed, we read the Friday evening services, and those who found it necessary said Kaddish. There were mostly GIs there, and a lot of them brought along some candy for the children who happened to be around. February of 45, still in France. I just got back from seeing Mr. Skeffington with Betty Davis and Claude Rains. The producers, a couple of Jewish brothers, really took a chance in presenting the problem of the Jew into a motion picture. It is a delicate situation, and it was handled very, very well. In fact, when Claude Rains tries to tell his daughter about the advantages she would have by not following the Jewish faith, he's all tangled up. However, it's a forceful scene that should have impressed a lot of people who had anti-Semitic feelings. It made a deep impression on me, and I suppose on a lot of other Jewish people. I wonder what the effect was on others in the States. When Rains sits and plays with young Fanny, I nearly burst into tears, as it made me think so much of Carol Francis. She was about the same age in that scene. Then he said that a baby girl is always nice to have, as you can always kiss a girl, but when a boy gets old, you shake his hand. It was a very good picture. Let's see, then this is Passover in Nancy, France in March of 45. Well, last night I got 3 men to go with me to temple. We found a great turnout there, about 3,000 people, including civilians. They had a Seder, which I didn't expect as I ate regular chow at camp. We all sat together along one end of the table of the temple, and there were GIs galore there. The only ones who were allowed to sit at the Seder were the soldiers, and the civilians stood and served. The whole medical staffs of the hospitals must have been there. If any emergency operations had come up, it would have been a tragedy. There was a Jewish chaplain who carried on the services. He introduced a 1-star general who was stationed here in town, who gave a very enjoyable speech. He told us a story about a Jew who gave Washington all his money and possessions to help in the Revolutionary War. After that, he went to France and borrowed $2 million more for the colonies. After the war, he died in poverty and was forgotten. Now, he was a great factor in helping to build the nation which we have now, and which is now defeating another movement which had tried to wipe out the Jewish race. So we ought to be very proud to say that a Jew was responsible for our great country. It was a nice story, and I felt very proud. After the general finished, a Gentile chaplain was introduced who gave us a strong speech in which he asked us to live as Abraham and Moses wanted us to live. After those two left, the Seder began. We had about 1/3 of a glass of white wine, a few bitter herbs, horseradish, and English-made matzahs. The first thing they served was gefilte fish, then potatoes, then buttered asparagus. It was a very nice thing to do, but there were so many men there, and it was so noisy that it really wasn't a well carried out Seder. May of 45, Darmstadt, Germany. As to the address of your aunt in Vienna, I'll hang on to it, but I doubt if I'll ever go any further than the place in which we are now. If any of the boys does have an occasion to go down that way, I'll give him the address and have him try to locate the family at the Institute for the Blind. I do hope the Nazis left the blind alone while they occupied the country. May 45, still Germany. One thing I'm glad to see is that the people back home are really seeing the atrocities which the Nazis had committed. You would be very much surprised if you really knew how deeply rooted the Nazi theory is embedded in their minds. It's been a matter of years of extensive propaganda, and we can't knock that influence out in kind treatment. They only understand atrocity and cruelty, so that is the way we ought to treat them. Well, that must have been quite a relief when Aunt Ruth called up and told you that her nephew had been liberated. He must have gone through a lot to be in the hospital now. It's a wonder they didn't kill all of the Jewish prisoners. June of 45 in Germany. Here it is Sunday, and a very pretty one at that. In the morning, I saw the civilians going to church in great throngs. At times, I wonder what in the heck they pray to. I know that there are still churches around here, and I've seen nuns walking about. However, how could God-fearing people ever allow such a creature as Hitler to get into power and still believe in God? He not only persecuted the Jews, he also mistreated the Catholics in his early years in power. Now, everybody goes about as though nothing ever happened to affect their lives. I'd like to have seen and heard a Gentile sermon when Nazism was in full bloom. I recall the period during the early 30s when Hitler had just been voted as Chancellor of the Reichstag, that the people also were guilty of looting the homes of the Jews who had been thrown out and beaten to death. They are these same people who are in these same cities today, and that is one thing I will never forget. I can assure you I will make things as difficult as possible for them as long as I have to stay here. At times, I have a great desire to wear a Juden band on my arm and see what the effect will be. Well, this was the day of prayer for them, and I hope they didn't pray for another Wehrmacht in about 20 years. June of 45 in Germany. Today was the first time the German public have been shown some of the atrocities at the various concentration camps. I wonder how they feel when they see things like that for which they are responsible. I just walked across the street where they're being shown, and people just stand and don't even seem to be affected by the pictures of these men tortured to death by their fellow Germans. These people are nothing but a lot of cold-blooded and heartless killers, even though they don't wear uniforms. Also June of 45, Germany. As I was walking back from the show one evening, I happened to notice a place with mosaic work on the wall. At first, it didn't even faze me, but after realizing that there aren't many such places in Germany, I looked again, and going up to the second floor, I saw there was a Star of David built into the wall. It had been a Jewish synagogue at one time. I tried to see inside, but all that I could see was a lot of bags and boxes. So it must have been used as a warehouse for the Nazis after they ran the Jews out and took whatever they wanted. Isn't it ironical that Nazism is dead now and the synagogue is still standing? Right in Germany, too. July 45, Germany. Sergeant Fay told me about his trip, which was uneventful except for the fact they stopped at Dachau, but were refused admittance because it was said that typhus was prevalent there. He did say that he saw one fellow who was on a detail there not long ago, and he had to assist in cremating 1,400 bodies at one time. He said that he still does not know what kept him from going out of his mind while there. July 45, Germany. I wrote you about my having some shoes made. Well, it seems that the original owner of the place was a Jew. When the Nazis were starting their purge, one employee saved this Jew's life and that of another. Out of gratitude for what was done, he gave the whole works to the present owner. Today, the liberated Jew came back to visit. He dropped in just to say hello, and he's giving his former employee a hand while he's here. That is the very first case I have heard of a German saving the life of a Jew. The Jew isn't even from Germany, as he was born in Rio de Janeiro. What do you think of that? Short time later. I went over to the shoemakers to find out when I could expect my shoes. Well, I met this Jewish fellow while there, and he told me that he had word that one of the big SS leaders of this city was back in town, so he wanted my suggestion. I took him over to the CIC, sort of the FBI, and he was interrogated there. The Jewish fellow said that in a couple of hours, he could get more people who knew more about it, and also the names and addresses of the men who helped in the concentration camp, which was not far from here. He also said there were 183 Jews buried in that vicinity, and that these men were responsible for these crimes. He said that most of them had been shot in the back of the head. Those who were wounded were shot again while on the ground. After lunch, I went up to the CIC and found 2 of the Jewish fellows there whom I knew and another new one. Finally, an American civilian took us into his office and he went into the questioning more thoroughly. It seems that he wants everything in black and white. He wants written or seen evidence of maltreatment. He isn't any too convinced about the fellows who were mentioned by these Jews. However, personally, I think it's a lot better to go out and bring in a suspect and question him rather than suspect him, build up a case, and then find that he has fled. So Monday, these men are to return to the CIC and perhaps they will go out to pick up the suspects. Can you picture the Gestapo allowing such a thing to carry over for 2 days? So I guess I'll be around if and when they drag these Jerrys in, and I hope that the CIC tortures them. August of 45, Germany. If you think that the anti-Semitic feeling is bad in the States, you'd better not come to England. It is 3 to 4 times as great. That is a very conservative estimate, too. I never heard such open expression of opinion as I did in London. I was told how Sir Oswald Mosley, the Hitler representative in England, took as many followers into the lower eastern section of London and were on the way to beat up the Jews in that part of the city. Well, the Jews had caught wind of it and were ready with their Christian friends, and they beat the devil out of the attacking force. It is certainly amazing such outright expression is allowed to flourish in England. Even Churchill, upon the murder of the anti-Semitic military governor in Palestine, said that each Jew in the British kingdom, no matter whether man, woman, or child, will be held responsible for that action. With Prime Minister Attlee in now, the Jews hope to get a better deal because they are well represented by the unions. September 45, Darmstadt, Germany. I was lucky to receive your letter in the morning, as in it was the request to try to locate Bertha Rothschild, or Mrs. Ross's lawyer in Frankfurt. Well, I decided to try the lawyer first, as I had his address, and as he had married a Gentile, I figured that he had a good possibility of still being in Frankfurt. I finally got to Ulandstrasse and then looked for 54. I found 55 and looked across the street and saw a large apartment completely destroyed and thought that was it. But I went a little further and found that it was the building next to it. I asked where I could find the Khans and was directed to the second floor. As I walked up, I saw a Star of David posted on the wall saying that this was a Jewish home. I wonder if that has been there a long time. I rang the bell and a young girl answered the door. A little after I was ushered into the apartment, a tall and elderly woman came out and took me into a study. We introduced ourselves, and then I told her the story of your letter and the people involved. Fortunately, this woman spoke English, so I was able to converse a lot better than if it was in German or Yiddish. She said that this Mrs. Ross must be the same woman whose name was Rosenberg or something like it. And she changed her name when she went to the States. Is that correct? She took the information and told me she didn't think that there was much likelihood of locating Dr. Maas's sister if she was at that camp in Czechoslovakia, as there weren't many who have returned up until now. However, she's going to speak to her husband about it and then ask the rabbi and see if he knows anything about them, as he was at that camp. The home in which they live was not the prettiest, but I guess they are fortunate to even have a place compared to what the other German Jews have now. And then finally, I wanted to read the letter my dad sent to my mom when he learned that FDR had died. I know there's been a lot of revisionist thinking about Roosevelt and how he treated Jews and his opinions of them, but here is what my father had to say. This is in April of 45 when he was in Germany. After evening chow yesterday, I received the Stars and Stripes, which headlined the death of FDR. We had heard a rumor of it that morning, but nothing definite until later in the day. It was very hard to even think that he was gone. Just the other day, I wrote that all big things happened during the month of April during this war, but I never dreamt it could have been his death. Now the war will have to end this month in order to make up for the tremendous loss which we had suffered. As a man, he was no different than any other man who comes from America. However, as our president and a symbol of free-thinking people, the rest of the world has lost more than we. They were counting heavily on him and his influence on all the other allied countries. We, the Jewish people in particular, have lost a representative voice. We will miss him greatly and will never again find a man from another faith who will do so much to try to beat down anti-Semitism as he did. I don't know what others say about it, but I felt that he was doing us a great favor in being our president again. Not that we were doing him a favor by re-electing him to that unthankful office. Now that he has worked himself to death, as Wilson had done after the first war, I hope the Allies will not repeat the mistakes which they committed during Wilson's time. They owe that much, at least, to his memory. I'm afraid that the Americans will never fully realize how great a man he actually was. It's only after one gets away from his home country that he's able to see how popular the American and his ideas are in other lands. The Italians will miss him most of all the countries who look to him for aid. I guess many South American countries will alter their views after the European war is ended. I doubt very much if any of them will wage war in the Pacific theater in person. Well, international politics were never my line, so why worry about them? However, I do hope they don't forget the man who helped to save their countries from invasion while his countrymen were calling him a warmonger. So there you have the tip of the iceberg of the letters that my dad sent home to Mom and my sister. And, you know, of course, I've left out all my darling, my dearest, all your love, I miss you the most, but the letters are dripping with his yearning, his passion. His passion wasn't only the hatred of the Nazis, it was also the aching to be with, you know, trying to raise a toddler from half a world away. So I'm at this point want to share some more of the photos that Dad brought back with him from the war. Let's see, Mike, let me see the net. Yes, that is Dad on a street in Oran, Algeria in March of 1944. He had never been further from America than the Canadian border. So in addition to the fact that he was, you know, fighting a world war, he was also fascinated at seeing so many historic and strange foreign lands. So that's that picture. The next one is the fellow pinning the medals is Lieutenant Walter Maddox, pinning good conduct medals on Dad's unit in February of '44 in Algeria. Several months later, my dad would help bring about the court-martial of Lieutenant Maddox. He told me that Maddox would get liquored up and start fights with the boys. He was unruly and abusive. He gambled. He borrowed money from the servicemen. Just a bad egg. And Dad's description of the court-martial reminded me a bit of Cane Mutiny, because when they were all in Algeria, all of the guys under my dad, who was a staff sergeant, would complain to him about Maddox and how mistreated they were and how they wished something could be done about it. Then during the court-martial, all these guys my dad had been counting on to come through, when they had to testify, said, "Oh no, I never had a problem with the lieutenant. No, nothing, no complaints." And so it was almost as if Dad was left to twist in the breeze with his testimony about how bad Maddox was, which caused him to become the target of Maddox's lawyers, because here's this guy that is singling Maddox out as the, here's the one guy that's willing to say some truth about it, which made Dad get really philosophical about his fellow man and how disappointed he felt that they left him to twist in the breeze. They did court-martial Maddox, but they only transferred him to another unit, so there wasn't a severe penalty for it. But that's that fellow. Next picture. That is not Mariupol, Ukraine. That is Naples, Italy, in the spring of '44. Dad got out of that Jeep to take this picture to give Mom an idea of what a typical street in Naples, Italy looked like after all of the bombing. The next picture is Dad smiling over the body of a dead Nazi in the Alban Hills of Italy. I suppose this could appear ghoulish in retrospect, the idea that he's smiling over this dead person, but we have to keep in mind historical context. The Nazis were trying and succeeding in killing large numbers of Americans and allies, and of course the Holocaust. So, Dad's life was constantly at peril. Consequently, it pleased him to see the enemy killed. So, I'm sure if there were a picture of a Nazi gloating over the body of a dead American, it would be a gut punch. But in this case, it's a picture I've seen, ever since I was a kid. And as a kid, I thought it was neato. But that is war. And you really do have to put yourself in the mindset of the people at the time and not look back retroactively with political correctness or, looking outside the lines of where these GIs were at trying to save their lives and make the world safe for democracy. The next picture, that is the mezuzah that Dad was given by the rabbi at the Nancy, France synagogue. It's a little worse for wear, but it has been through a world war. So I still have that in a box. The next picture is, that is the Passover service at the synagogue in Nancy, France, with Dad with his arm around his buddy Les Feldman and some other Jewish guys who were there. At the Seder, you can see Dad is actually eating a piece of matzah from a box of matzah. The picture, I think it's a remarkable picture that it exists at all. It was taken by Stars and Stripes magazine, but because of that big black scratch that you see that seems to extend diagonally from Les Feldman's mouth, that scratch was on the negative, which rendered it unusable in publications because there was no Photoshop in 1945. But they did let Dad keep a copy of it, and I'm very grateful they did because now we can see. This was also on my dad's 29th birthday, Passover. Dad was a little older than the guys under him. He said they called him old man, even though he was in his 20s, because they were in their late teens and early 20s. So also he also had, I think, more of a old-fashioned work ethic and expected the people under him to be as dedicated and conscientious as he was. So he would get frustrated that they weren't, so consequently they saw him as the old man. Next photo is actually the front and back of the mimeographed program from the Passover 45 in Nancy, France. That's a drawing of the front of the synagogue. And then on the back, he had some of his buddies sign Happy Passover. So yeah, that fragile artifact has survived over the years. Next picture is, again, looking at them from the perch of 2022 is different from at the time. This is a French woman in Nancy, France, who was caught by the FBI. She was a collaborator, which meant that she gave aid and comfort to the Nazis who were killing her brother's, father's, husband's, friends, countrymen, etc. They would humiliate them. They would shave their heads and paint swastikas on them and parade them through the streets. Again, it seems ghastly to do this to a human being, but we must not lose sight of historical perspective. This woman was, making the war a little bit rougher by, messing around with Nazis for favors. And that was the price that they felt she should pay at the time. Kind of a remarkable image for a lot of reasons. The next photo, that is my dad and his pal Doug Winikoff at what was left of the bridge from Ludwigshafen to Mannheim, Germany in May of '45. They did not blow up the bridge, but they were happy to pose in front of the blown up bridge, and it does make for a nice wartime shot. Next picture is Dad with his beloved Nancy. He named her after Nancy, France, and she went with him everywhere after that. He took her in his Jeep when he'd go on a supply, picking up supplies somewhere. She was always leaping into the Jeep to sit next to him. And she really provided, literal creature comforts, given how badly Dad missed his wife and daughter. And Nancy had quite an impish personality. She upstaged the pinning of a medal. The commanding officer was issuing a medal to someone for bravery, and the whole company was out standing at attention, and Nancy leapt out a window from the first floor and went barking and running up onto the stage. And Dad also brought her to a movie, and when the guy started kissing the girl on screen, the soldiers were making kissy noises, so Nancy went running up and barking at the screen. Anyway, this is in front of the Ulm Cathedral. Next picture is, that is what the view was from the top of the Ulm Cathedral in Germany. That was a major thoroughfare, and the buildings on that thoroughfare. Interesting panoramic view of just complete destruction. The next picture, Bob Hope. Some of the more amusing letters are when Dad got to see some second string USO shows. We only hear about Bob Hope and Crosby and Fred Astaire and the top flight talent. But Dad will talk about, well, there was an accordionist and a comedian who wasn't very funny and a tap dancer. Or we went to this one and there were supposed to be a lot of dancing girls, but there was just one couple demonstrating ballroom dancing. But, they were so hungry for any kind of entertainment, they still went and enjoyed themselves, but it wasn't all. But Dad was very excited that they were finally going to get to see the Bob Hope show in July of '45 in Darmstadt, Germany. So Dad had a great seat. As you can see, he took this picture of Hope resting before going on. And Dad had his trusty Nancy dog with him. And while a woman was tap dancing, I don't know if that's her on the right, her head there, but there was a woman tap dancing, and as she got to the finale, her taps got more furious, which freaked out Nancy, who leapt out of Dad's arms went running across the stage barking, which stopped the woman from dancing. Then Dad called Nancy back and grabbed her up. Then Hope came out and walked up to the microphone, and he looked at my dad and he said, "You better grab that dog. If Crosby sees it, he'll throw a saddle over it." Because Bing Crosby was investing in racehorses at the time. And slang back then for a bad horse, a horse that couldn't run well, was a dog. So Dad, he made that joke to Dad. And then in a very surreal twist, I was at Bob Hope's house nearly 50 years later in Toluca Lake. I was with Dick Cavett, who's a longtime friend of mine, and he went there to interview Bob Hope. And in between tapings, they taped 2 shows back to back. So while they were changing the tapes, Hope was just strolling around with his hands in his pockets, whistling. And I said, in 1945 in Darmstadt, Germany, and I told him the story of Nancy and my dad and the dog, and I told him his line about, "You better grab that at Crosby season." And Hope chuckled when I told him that. He said, "Is that what I said? Isn't that something? I said that." So he got a kick out of his own cleverness almost half a century later. And it was very strange and gratifying to be able to hand the line back to the man who had said it during the war to my father. So, and the last image here is of the 64th Fighter Wing, which was what my dad was a part of in the Signal Corps. And their motto is Mors Semper Tyrannis, which means death always to tyrants. So that was their insignia. And finally, in February of 1992, my sister Patty sat my dad down and did an oral history. She had a series of questions about his childhood and upbringing and marriage and all that. And she asked him about his wartime experiences. And so he spent a few minutes talking about them. So you'll be able to hear the man himself talk about some of the things I just described. And what none of us could have known was that he would die later that year of a respiratory problem that he didn't have then. Here he is at nearly 76.
When you went into the military, we were already at war.
We were at war.
And when was it that you went in? What year?
I went in January of 43.
And went to California.
And they sent us to Jefferson Barracks for servicing. Went to, what was this town in Kansas? I'll never forget the barracks there. It was about 10 below zero. Maybe about 6 lights in this great big barracks that had about 100 guys in there. Ice cold water to shave with. That's what I remember about Kansas. From there, they put us on a train and sent us down to Clearwater, Florida. And that's where we had basic training. And then we went by train across the country to Pinedale, California, which is adjacent to Fresno. Camp Pinedale originally was a camp for the poor Japanese.
You mean a displacement camp?
It was a displacement camp for them, but it wasn't good enough to live in because of muddy conditions there, but they gave it to the GIs to use. So I remember walking through mud up to my knees and on wood planks for sidewalks. And we were there. Oh yeah, then Amy and Carol came out, and I got an apartment on Van Ness in Fresno, and I was able to get home at night and weekends until we were alerted. And
so was it a short time until you had to leave, or?
I guess they were just out a few months.
Few months.
Because then we were shipped by train back to the East Coast to Hampton Roads, Virginia. Put us on a Liberty boat that was 10,500 tons, which is tiny. And then the storms began.
Oh.
And even the sailors were getting sick. So we puked for 3 days.
And where'd you land?
And we finally landed at Oran, Algeria, the northern coast of Africa. And we were sent to an area near Lion Mountain. And we had an area that was like 30 below, not 30 below, but 30 degrees at night, and about 70 during the day. So you had hot and cold, and sometimes you wake up with ice over you. But we lived in tents, and when the African campaign was ended, we went over to Italy, where we landed at Naples. What else would you like to know? You want the continuation? From Naples, we moved up toward Rome. Some of the fellows went into a casino. We lost one man in a casino.
You lost one man in a casino?
No, at casino, which was a very tough area to get the German troops out of. Also at, no, I've forgotten the name of it. I was just about to give it to you when we started talking. There was a mountain north of Naples that the Germans had dug in and made it very difficult for Allied troops to get up. Here they are shooting right down at you. And finally they brought in a Polish group who had been experienced in mountain climbing, and with their donkeys were able to bring up their equipment. And finally they took this mountain. And that broke the strength of the Germans in that area, and we went up gradually up toward Rome. And when Rome fell, they pulled us back into a staging area near Naples, and then we took a LST from there to southern France. That was
Is that
before.
when you were in Nancy?
Now that was before the invasion of Europe in northern France. So we were in southern France before that. So we landed at Saint-Tropez, and unfortunately it was not a resort. It was a little warmer. And went from there on up the Rhone Valley to Dijon, to Nancy, which was in Alsace-Lorraine. So we stayed in Nancy for a while, setting up communication lines with telephone, telegraph, and teletype.
And you had a dog there.
And that's where I got my little Dalmatian, Nancy. And then we crossed, when the crossings began at the Rhine, we crossed over at Mannheim and Ludwigshafen, Germany. And then went a little south to Darmstadt. And we ended up in a cavalry school right off the Autobahn, and that's where the war ended.
So how long were you overseas totally?
3 years.
Whoa. That's a long time.
So while we were in Oran, I got hold of a bottle of Moet Chandon champagne, and I was able to send it back home, and told my beloved wife not to open this until after I got home. And sure enough, it was there when we all got together again.
Wonderful.
You were speaking about Nancy, my dog. The first dog I got was in Italy, and it was a little brown dog, and I named him Buck because I paid 100 lira for him, and 100 lira was $1. And Buck stayed with us for a while until we were starting to move up to our Rome, and these big half-tracks were coming through, making a lot of noise and rumbling and shaking the earth from the tracks. And this poor little dog had gotten down on the ground and got so nervous it ran underneath the tracks of one of these half-tracks. So a little later I was able to pick up Nancy that kept us into England.
And then how did you leave Nancy when it was time to leave?
I had to. I said goodbye, Nancy.
Well, did you turn her over to somebody?
No, just left her in the barracks. And whoever's in the barracks still took care of Nancy.
So you got home from the war. Now Carol is about 4 or 5.
Carol was
What year did you get home?
45, December.
Yeah, so she was born in 42.
Yeah, 3.
She's 3.5. Well, that must have been a big change from when you were in Fresno with her.
Oh, yeah. And she sang "Kiss Me Once and Kiss Me Twice."
Carol did?
And "Kiss Me Once Again." It's been a long, long time.
So that was the man himself, reflecting on his wartime journeys. Before we do the Q&A, I'm always bad with salesmanship, but I am compelled to tell you how you can get a copy of Salamis and Swastikas, Letters Home from a GI Jew. It is available in Kindle or in book form on Amazon. Or if you would like a copy signed by me or personalized to you by me, you can order that from my website, Steve Stoliar, STOLIAR.com. And I suppose I should probably briefly mention why it's called Salamis and Swastikas, because as I started going through the letters, I was dumbstruck by how often Dad would ask Mom to send him a salami. It was only afterward that I found out that the slogan of Katz's Delicatessen in New York is "Send a salami to your boy in the army," because Mr. and Mrs. Katz had 3 sons who all were fighting in World War II and who all wanted salamis. But I couldn't believe how often, in and around all the stuff about the destruction and hating the Nazis and missing the heck out of his wife and kids, and the movies they saw, and the songs, and the pangs of homesickness that listening to Begin the Beguine on the radio while he's writing the letters. In and around all that, he's saying, if you could find your way to send me a kosher salami. And then the first, he was just waiting for it to arrive. And then the first couple arrived rotten because they'd been in the hold of a ship during the summer from the States to Italy. And he was just crestfallen that he couldn't eat it. And then finally the salamis would start arriving in good shape. But his buddies, he would say, even my Gentile buddies want it. They've never tasted anything like this. Louis eats salami, but he eats the Italian hard salami. And it's all this stuff about the salami. And then he'd say, I think you're using up too many of your meat points. You and the baby need to, so let's hold off on that. And then a little while later, but if you do happen to come across maybe a small kosher salami, I could go for that. And also kosher pickles. And she sent him a tin of shrimp. And he said, I'm going to hold off on opening up the shrimp until I get some cocktail sauce. And I thought, well, here you are in the middle of a world war, as he was very aware of, because he makes references to, that this is another world war and we're going to have more, and we had one before. He's saying, why have shrimp if you can't make shrimp cocktail out of it. So there's a lot of references to different foodstuffs and beverages and the kinds of wines they had. And it's interesting because, again, those are details that are usually left out, but his reportage was so detailed that you ended up getting them. Okay, Mike, let's begin the interrogation.
Yeah, and that, and that send a salami tradition goes back, to World War I and continues to the present day. There's still guys asking for salamis when they're stationed overseas. Getting to the Q&A, here's one from Larry Holman. My father never talked much about his experiences as a paratrooper machine gunner in Europe, except for the fact that after the Battle of the Bulge and the loss of the assistant machine gunner, went all the way to Paris. He said shortly before he died that he spent his whole life trying to forget all that and didn't want to talk about it. Do you feel fortunate to have this documentation?
Yes, again, even beyond its value as part of our family's history, I was a history major at UCLA for a couple of years. I've had a passion for archaeology all my life. I worked at Groucho's house as his archivist, putting things in order for posterity. The detail that he put into reporting his experiences, I think at the time are invaluable. And I was also grateful that the war was not so traumatic that he wouldn't talk about it. Whenever I would ask him questions, he always had answers. And I'm sorry he wasn't around once we finally read the letters, because I had all sorts of questions having read the letters that will never be answered. But no, I'm very grateful he was open about it and never said it's too painful. But many's the time in the letters that he says, I never want to hear the word army again. I can't wait to get out of this. And he, the experience dealing with the politics of commanding officers getting preferential treatment, and he's getting pressure from above and then from the guys below that see him as management, But no, I'm very grateful that so much has been left, and that I'm happy to share with people who can appreciate what a little time capsule is it.
Had you heard a lot of the stories before going back to the letters? Things like
there were stories he told that are in the letters, stories he told that aren't in the letters, like when his commanding, I put this in the epilogue, his commanding officer sent him on a supply run and told him to take this long curving road around a field. And he got to the field and he thought, this is silly. I could be there in half the time. I'll just cut through the field. So he drove the Jeep through the field. And when he got to the far end, he looked behind him and there was a sign that said, Achtung, Minen. So he had driven through a minefield. I guess he didn't write Mom about that because he, A, didn't want to worry her, or B, did not want her to read him the riot act on following orders and getting blown to bits. Or both. So there were some of them that it was great to read them as they were happening, like the Bob Hope story, which he loved telling, to read, hey, I saw Bob Hope today and here's what happened. It's like, there it is, living history.
Here's one from Leslie Weiner. I'm surprised that the letters were uncensored with the names of places and details. There was some censorship, right?
There was some censoring, yes. Well, first of all, he was friends with the censoring officer, but even so, he was conscientious enough not to give too much away. And at one point, he did say, you remember a while back, I wasn't able to tell you where I was. Well, now I'm free to tell you I was at, and it's this neatly clipped hole in the paper where the censor cut it out. But after the fact, Dad was able to talk about where he was. By the way, I should probably say that my mom's letters don't exist for two reasons. One is, as he said in one of the letters, we are not allowed to keep letters from home because they could fall into the wrong hands because nobody was censoring the letters from home. And if it says something like, I hear that you're going to be in Berlin on Thursday, you don't want the Germans to get that. The other is he would have had to schlep a duffel bag crammed with hundreds of letters up over hill and dale through mud and sleet to take the letters with her. But he was meticulous enough in his responses that you get a strong sense of what she's asking about, what she was telling him about. She'll say, I read an article that said this. What about these robot bombs I'm hearing about? What about this? Were you anywhere near this? And, you know, you asked me about this, or you asked me to find out about this. So you get Dad addressing each of the things in each of the letters. So you get her voice in a sense.
One from Alice Levy, actually, I guess I can address this one. Do you think any Jewish soldiers sent letters home in Yiddish written in the Hebrew alphabet? For fun, any Yiddish in your dad's letters?
Well, Dad didn't. I suppose some did. If that was their basic language at home, I'm sure they wrote home in whatever language was most easily. But I guess what would be interesting about that is, how do you censor a letter that's in a foreign language? How would the censoring officer know what he's reading? So I'm not sure, but I would think that answer's out there, but I don't have it.
I have seen some, but it's definitely in the World War II generation.
But my point is, I think, a valid one, which is, how do you censor something?
Yeah,
You're holding it.
Question. I'm not sure if censors would have allowed that or not. Jeffrey Sachs.
Not that the Nazis would have been able to read the Hebrew either.
Yeah, the Yiddish, as a spoken language, often very much came in handy for Jews.
But the Yiddish is very close to German, but if they wrote in Hebrew, it's unlikely the Nazis would have caught on to it. Anyway, yes?
From Jeff Sachs, did your dad get commissioned as he's wearing bars in that pic with the dead German soldier? And he points out that in Desert Storm, he received green salamis in the mail.
Ew. What was his question about?
He said he's wearing
bars
in the picture with the dead German soldier. So did he get commissioned as an officer?
No, he was thinking of becoming a commissioned officer, and and there's letters about thinking about going to school to learn that, and that was his plan. And then when he got a solid dose of the politics between the kind of useless court martial of Maddox and getting chewed out for things that the people under him did, and getting attacked by the people under him who saw him as this big meanie for making them have to account for lost or damaged equipment and all that sort of stuff. He wanted nothing to do with continuing on in the service, and couldn't wait to get home and sit back with a beer and listen to a ball game on the radio. So no, he was not commissioned. He changed his mind from experience.
Here's a couple from Norm Stone. What was your dad's educational background before the war? What did he do with his life after the war?
He only barely got through high school. He actually left high school before graduating in order to get a job, because that was during the Depression. And it was in the course of the letters, he talks about getting his high school equivalents after he was married and a father. He followed through and finally passed to get his high school diploma from University City High in St. Louis. But, they really, I think the letters are remarkably literate for someone who didn't have a college education, but he was very much in tune with history, with art and architecture, because he just enjoyed it. So he soaked that stuff in growing up, and then it came into use then. After the war, he was initially went to work for my mother's father's dry goods company in St. Louis. And then after that, he worked at a chemical corporation training salesmen. And when they opened up their LA branch, we all took Route 66 out here. And that's how we ended up in Los Angeles. So he was a businessman helping to train salesmen.
And Norm Stone also asks, what is your age? Coincidentally, I am 74 and was also a history major at UCLA.
I am 67, and with any luck, will be 68 in September. I expect something from you at that time. But
Okay, I think we'll finish up with this one. Did your father remain lifelong friends with any of his army buddies? Did his unit have reunions?
he didn't. I think he really wanted to put it behind him. Again, not because it was traumatic, but because it was such an ongoing stress fest. And he wanted nothing more than to get home and back. And Mom had found a house, which is the one that my other sister and I were born and grew up partly in. And he didn't keep in touch. He had an astonishing ability to find people he knew no matter where he was. And I saw it firsthand when he and I went to Europe in '81. But you could take giant forceps and drop him anywhere in the world. And he'd say, "Aren't you Abe Golubach? Didn't you go to U City High?" And so he had buddies that he had for a long time, but they were never his war buddies. And he wasn't someone that tended to go to, reunions or veteran things. He was due for a marksmanship medal. And we said, "Why don't you apply for it?" And he said, So we still don't have his marksmanship medal because he just thought, why bother? The war's over. Let's get on with life.
We do have a couple of questions in the chat asking for people for an update on the movie version of Raised Eyebrows. Maybe we can just end with that.
Sure. Okay, well, shifting gears and stripping them in the process. Raised Eyebrows, My Years Inside Groucho's House, the story of me as a 19-year-old getting this plum job working for my idol in the last years of his life and getting to know him and spend time with him and the two brothers who were still alive, Zeppo and Gummo, Chico and Harpo having died years earlier, and getting to meet all sorts of people from in front of and behind the cameras of his people that wrote and directed his films, and Mae West and Bob Hope and George Burns and all these people. But the dark side was getting close to my hero as he's fading out, and also having to deal with a very mercurial aspiring actress named Erin Fleming, who had gradually taken over his life personally and professionally and alienated his friend. So it was a real balancing act I had, which was overwhelmingly positive, but also a real maturing experience to go through when you're 20. We have managed to snag Jeffrey Rush to play the elderly Groucho. There is only the elderly Groucho in it. It's not a biography of Groucho. It's about the years I spent in the 70s working at his house. And Erin Fleming, the mercurial actress, will be played by Sienna Miller, whom I'm in the midst of watching an Anatomy of a Scandal on Netflix this week, which is very good. And young Steve will be played by an actor named Charlie Plummer, who doesn't look anything like me, but who cares what I looked like when I was 20. I say we look enough alike to be neighbors, or we're eerily dissimilar. But it doesn't matter. He's got the chops to do it. And it's going to be positively surreal to walk onto the set that is meant to reconstruct a house I spent the better part of 3 years in, and see people playing people I knew, including someone playing me. It's a mirror within a mirror within a mirror, but it's very gratifying. It's been a very long and winding road, and I've held out for people that wanted to be true to the book instead of just seeing it as a launching point for something wildly different. But I stuck with it because I only had, one cow to trade for my handful of magic beans, and finally getting a beanstalk out of it this fall.
All right, yeah, sounds great. Steve, thanks so much for doing this.
My pleasure.
We will send a follow-up email to everyone who registered with links to buy the book.
Thank you.
We recorded this, and so thanks everyone for being on, and have a good afternoon.
You too.